Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 29. Day 5. St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church was lined with stained glass windows. On this Sunday in September, they cast a kaleidoscope of colors across the wooden pews and the congregation. The smoky aroma of incense mingled with the quiet rustling of prayer books. Father Ted's comforting voice filled the sacred space, his words painting vivid pictures of faith and redemption as he conducted Mass. Dan Kelly sat near the front next to his niece, who was in turn next to her mother. He welcomed their company. Today, Allison sat beside him. Typically, she sat on the other side of her mother, but today, she sat beside him. Dan admitted to himself that he liked the change. Nearby, the Ramirez family occupied their usual spot, a noticeable gap where Chico should have been. Recently, Dan had seen Chico with a pretty girl, strolling down Main Street. Dan suspected that might account for Chico's absence. The church was packed to the rafters, a measure of Father Ted's magnetic presence and the community he had fostered. As Mass progressed, Dan's mind drifted back to Rome, to the day when he first met Father Ted. The memory unfurled like an old photograph, edges worn, but the image razor-sharp. In those dark days after the war, Dan had been adrift, his faith shaken by the pain and death he'd witnessed. Ted, with his generous laugh and unwavering compassion, had thrown him a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink of despair. Their friendship had blossomed amidst the ancient streets of Rome, a bond forged in shared experiences and mutual understanding. When Dan returned to the States, he convinced Ted to come with him. Captain Dan Kelly then visited the Archbishop of Los Angeles and asked that Father Ted be assigned to St. Mary's in Redstone. The Archbishop, a native New Yorker, was happy to grant this simple request to a war hero. The impact had been immediate and profound. Ted's homilies were more than sermons. They were performances that captivated the heart. His words wove together scripture and modern life, touching hearts and inspiring minds. Under his care, the small parish had flourished into a vibrant community. Ted's voice rang through the church as he finished reading the gospel.
For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome. Lacking clothes, and you clothed me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to see me.
He picked up the Bible, kissed it reverently, closed it, and placed it back on the pulpit. The entire church edged forward in anticipation. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Father Ted's homily.
My dear friends, these words from Matthew remind us of our duty to one another. In times of trouble, it's easy to turn inward, to focus solely on our own struggles. But Christ calls us to look outward, to see the pain and suffering of those around us, and to lend a hand.
His introduction over, Father Ted set about to tell a tale.
When I was at university in Warsaw and Oxford, I studied English literature. I read the great poets and novelists. I studied how they portrayed romantic love. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. It is a powerful statement.
He smiled, his eyes sparkled.
As you know, I recently came to this country, America, the home of Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt.
He paused dramatically.
Mickey Mouse.
Laughter rippled through the pews.
And Donald Duck.
Ted added with a grin. The laughter grew louder, filling the church with warmth.
And I have learned how this idea of romantic love consumes everyone here. It is in books. It is in movies.
He leaned in conspiratorially.
I do have to tell you, I shed a few tears when I saw Little Women.
More chuckles ran through the pews.
This preoccupation with romance is on the radio, in serials, and in almost every song on the hit parade. It seems to come down to, I love you, as in the song, Say Those Words to Me.
The priest cleared his throat and broke into song, his rich baritone filling the church.
You can send me roses, you can write me rhymes. Tell me about the moonlight, we've heard it 1,000 times. But there's one sweet sentence, simple as can be. The moment that you say it, you'll set my spirit free.
The members of the congregation loved this, their faces lighting up. They'd heard Father Ted break into song before, but it never failed to delight them. His voice, deep and resonant, seemed to touch something within each person.
Say those words to me, darling, can't you see they're the key to my heart's melody? Not a fortune, not a pearl, just a little phrase, my girl. Say I love you, and the world's all right with me.
As the last note faded, Ted waited until he had everyone's attention.
It doesn't matter if you're a fan of Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Katharine Hepburn, or Tennessee Williams. It feels as though I love you is the only thing that matters.
Dan found himself entirely enjoying Ted's charismatic delivery. He looked at Kate and Allison, seeing their rapt attention mirrored in the faces of those around them.
And I am not one to deny the importance of these 3 little words and the love they proclaim. I witnessed this love between my parents, between my sister, Sarah, and her husband. And I see this love between the husbands and wives of this parish. It is real, powerful, and it is one of God's greatest gifts.
And then Father Ted made his point.
But I want to say to you that there are 4 words more powerful, more important than I love you.
The entire congregation was hanging on Father Ted's voice.
Every parent knows these 4 words, every teacher, doctor, and every priest.
His message echoed across the sanctuary, the importance of his words reaching everyone.
It is what Christ taught us. It is what Matthew speaks about in today's gospel. The 4 words are, how can I help?
He paused again, letting the simplicity and power of the phrase sink in. The priest's eyes, kind and inviting, scanned his church. It was as if he were speaking to each person individually.
These words, how can I help? They are the very essence of love in action. They are the bridge between intention and impact, between faith and works.
The hush in the church was unifying, broken only by the occasional rustle of clothing as Ted's flock was inspired and captivated by the priest's message of love. Ted's eyes swept over the church.
There is a family in our town. They are not of this parish or even our faith. It would not matter to our Lord Jesus, and it should not matter to us.
Dan recognized the honest passion in Ted's voice when he spoke of those in need.
They need help. They are struggling. I have met the mother. She is a good woman doing the best she can.
Ted stopped for a moment, his eyes full of empathy.
Out of respect, I will not tell you their name. That too should not matter.
The church was silent, every ear attuned to Ted's words.
I have asked you to take the words, how can I help, to heart. This is one small way.
Ted gestured toward the back of the church.
There is a large wooden box in the vestibule.
Then, looking straight at Allison,
Thanks go to Alison Becker for making it look so nice, on very short notice.
Dan glanced at his niece, watching her nearly burst with pride at the mention of her name.
Please donate, whatever you can. Money or food, both will be well used and appreciated.
His eyes twinkled as he added,
Oh, I have been told to say, please, nothing that requires refrigeration.
and after a mischievous pause,
That does not apply to cold, hard cash.
he winked and smiled. Laughter rippled through the congregation again, serving to enhance the call of Ted's appeal. He was completely in his element, his warmth and sincerity authentic. Dan's chest swelled as his good friend commanded the room. He marveled at how Father Ted, once a stranger, had become someone the whole town now turned to for guidance and support. After Mass, family and neighbors socialized in front of the church as the heat of the day was just beginning. Dan caught Ted's eye, and they moved away from the crowd and talked.
Father Ted, for the past few days, whenever I see Allie, she gives me these giant hugs. I have asked her mother. She doesn't know. Do you have any idea what that's about?
The gregarious priest seemed to be delighted to hear this news. He responded.
She loves her uncle.
Then Father Ted delivered a self-assured shrug and said,
What else could it be?
as Dan was deciding whether to press the coy priest further, George Ramirez joined them. His sense for a story was twitching. He was certain something big was going on with Dan. Something much bigger than the routine crimes of Redstone. George knew it started a few days ago when Mike Fiorante showed up. He also knew that getting anything out of Dan was going to be tough. Then, as if on cue, Captain Mike Fiorante pulled up in his army car. George watched as Mike said hello to Kate and waved at Allie. Mike approached George, Dan, and Ted, and shook hands with the priest. Ted's eyes brightened as he greeted Mike.
You've just missed Mass, Michael. You must do better next week.
Mike's face shifted to a smile.
I certainly must.
George's response to Mike's arrival was entirely different. His reporter's instincts made him suspicious. He threw out a comment to see what reaction it would get.
Seeing a lot of you these days, Mike?
The question put the tiniest bit of hesitation into the sharp-eyed captain. Mike's reply was merely a feeble,
Yeah.
punctuated with a curt smile. As Mike turned to Dan, his expression changed, ever so slightly.
They want us in Los Angeles.
There was an urgency in Mike that was not lost on the old newspaperman or the priest. Dan turned to George and Father Ted to bid them goodbye. Before he could speak, Ted raised his palms as a sign of understanding, his smile warm and reassuring. Dan smiled gratefully at the two of them for accepting this interruption. Then he went to find Kate. She had already pieced together the situation and waved him off with a knowing look. Heading to the vehicle, Mike leaned close to Dan and spoke.
There's been another murder.
Dan stopped dead in his tracks, jaw clenched, his mind racing. The peaceful Sunday morning atmosphere evaporated, replaced by an all-too-real sense of dread.
Got a call from Detective Wilson last night. Their canvass of motels with that note used to book the room for Susie Duke's murder got a hit. Another meet with another victim at another motel was set. Thacker and company staked out the place and waited for hours. No girl and no killer.
Dan looked intently at Mike.
They were in the wrong place. The killer switched locations. Another murdered prostitute was found just over an hour ago.
Mike told Dan that Detective Wilson had ended his call last night by saying that with any luck, this would be over.
I expected to get another call this morning and surprise you at Kate's over breakfast.
The two men stood wordlessly, looking at each other. They knew, once again, that it would not be that easy. Standing about 30 feet away, next to the cheerful priest, George Ramirez saw Dan Kelly's dramatic response to whatever Mike Fioranti had told him. Dan's body seemed to collapse, the wind taken from his sails. George's eyes narrowed as he whispered to himself.
What the hell is going on?
The detective and the army captain reached the car, its metal already radiating the heat of the California sun. Dan hesitated, his hand suspended above the door handle, and looked back at the church. The good people of St. Mary's Parish were still milling about, their faces bright with Sunday morning good feelings. He envied their innocence, their obliviousness to the darkness that lurked not far from their idyllic town. Chapter 30. The Beach Inn stood as a splash of faded color against the backdrop of the Los Angeles coastline. Its aged turquoise and coral paint appeared muted and understated in clear contrast to the chaotic atmosphere that now engulfed the motel. The parking lot, which held a smattering of California and out-of-state vehicles the night before, was now swamped with black and white patrol cars. Their presence served as a declaration of what had taken place within the Beach Inn's walls a few hours before. Near the office, a policeman stood interviewing a small group of people, their faces filled with concern and curiosity. A blue 1940 Pontiac Torpedo Woody sat trapped among the police cars, its polished wooden panels bright in the morning sun. Through the car's windows, a family of tourists, surrounded by suitcases stacked to the roof, shifted restlessly in their seats. The father gripped the steering wheel while his wife, in the passenger seat, kept shaking her head as her words carried across the lot.
Horrible. Horrible.
The Pontiac's distinctive chrome nose pointed like a compass needle toward the exit, seeking escape from the awful drama. Dan and Mike pulled up to the police barricade. As they began to explain their reason for being there, Detective Rice's sharp eyes caught sight of them. With a quick wave, he ushered them through. Rice walked up as Mike parked, his face set in hard lines.
The boss is up there.
Jerking his thumb toward the second level.
Room 202.
The three men made their way across the lot, heat radiating off the asphalt. As they climbed the external staircase, the white paint of the railing chipped and peeled under their hands. Dan asked,
So, what do we have?
Walking along the external corridor, Rice spoke over his shoulder, his words clipped and professional.
Maid discovered the body at 8:40 this morning. The desk clerk called it in shortly after. Victim is Nancy Sanchez, well known to Vice, 27. We believe she arrived by cab around 8 last night. So far, no one saw or heard anything.
They arrived at room 202. Its sun-bleached blue door, a perfect match for the flaking white paint of the walkway. Dan and Mike stepped inside while Rice returned to the parking lot. Dan's eyes were immediately drawn to the body on the bed. Nancy Sanchez lay face up, fully clothed in her vibrant attire. Her eyes, once full of life and mischief, now stared blankly at the ceiling. A stab wound was high on her torso, very near her heart. A gaping wound in her stomach, jagged and brutal, had torn through her flesh. Blood had seeped from the horrific injury, forming a pool beneath her lifeless form. The crimson stain spread across the motel sheets, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the lingering perfume Nancy had applied liberally the night before. A weary senior detective, Colin Thacker, noticed Dan and Mike enter and approached them through the jumble of police and investigators.
Gentlemen, sorry for ruining your Sunday.
Dan and Mike responded with resigned shrugs. They'd seen enough scenes like this to know that crime didn't take Sundays off. Thacker's eyes narrowed.
This one is definitely our killer.
He flipped his hand toward the bed and the body on it.
Difference is, this one was killed with a knife, then mutilated. More like your murder in Rome.
Mike's brow furrowed.
Something spooked our killer?
Possibly.
Thacker said, his tone non-committal. He then shifted gears.
We thought we had this bastard last night. Waited for hours at the Ocean View Motel. Nothing. Then this.
Bastard. Dan and Mike looked back at the old detective. They could only offer support. Thacker rocked his head from side to side and let out a sigh of frustration. Dan looked around the room, searching for details that others might miss. His mind was already connecting dots and forming theories. Thacker, sensing Dan had more to say, led them to the bathroom, away from the churn of technicians working the crime scene. Dan scanned the cramped bathroom, his mind racing. He could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He rested against the cool tile wall and turned to face Thacker and Mike.
We've got a serious problem here. The murders are getting closer together.
Thacker's head bobbed, his worn face creasing with grim understanding.
Think about it,
Dan said, ticking off the points on his fingers.
More than 2 months between the first and second murders. Then 6 weeks to the third. And now?
Letting his words sink in.
Just 5 days.
Mike's face paled as Dan's words hit home.
This killer is working with impunity now. He's getting bolder, more confident with each kill. We have to stop him now, before he strikes again, because at this rate...
He left the sentence unfinished. Thacker and Mike exchanged worried looks. The reality of their predicament could be read on their faces. Dan knew they all felt it. The pressure, the urgency, the knowledge that lives hung in the balance. They had to act, and they had to act fast. The conversation over, Mike left the bathroom. Dan started to follow, but Thacker tapped him on the arm. Dan turned, meeting the detective's eyes.
You may have picked up that some of the officers think you should have gotten this guy in Rome.
As do I.
Thacker's expression softened.
Pay them no mind.
Offering a supportive smile. Feeling the need for a fatherly chat, Thacker spoke.
I have a little confession to make. In the briefing a few days ago, I said I talked to the FBI about you.
The old detective continued.
That was a lie. Well, it wasn't entirely accurate.
Dan was confused.
I talked to Angus about you.
This caught Dan off guard, the mention of Angus McCormick's name. His mentor's presence still loomed large years after Angus retired from the Redstone Police.
I didn't know you knew Angus.
Almost 40 years. Went to the academy together. Angus tells me you're better than we were.
A wide grin spread across his face.
I gotta tell you, we were pretty goddamn good.
You got all that stuff in the briefing from Angus?
Well, most of it. Some was off the cuff, and some was from the FBI.
Thacker's tone eased as he added,
Whatever happened in Rome, this here, it's not on you.
The senior detective used his eyes to point to the body in the next room. Dan studied Thacker's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could form the words, Thacker patted him on the shoulder and stepped out of the bathroom. Left alone, Dan moved to the doorway. Leaning against the frame, his eyes took in the disarray of the crime scene. Technicians moved carefully, cataloging evidence while the photographer worked on his latest assignment, a new entry in LA's album of murder. Rice re-entered room 202, clearly annoyed.
We've got a problem downstairs.
His voice tight.
There's a reporter here sniffing around. A woman named Catherine Thompson from the Standard. She's being a pain in the ass.
Casey,
said Mike. Then, in response to Rice's puzzled expression,
Catherine Celeste Thompson, KC.
A look passed between Mike and Dan. They'd known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. Thacker sensed there was more to the story. He shot a questioning look at Dan and Mike.
She knows us. Tried to get something out of us at City Hall earlier.
Dan jumped in.
I spun her a yarn, but...
She didn't buy it,
Thacker said, not needing confirmation. The fact that they were having this conversation said as much. Still hovering near the door, Rice pressed on.
So what do we do about Thompson?
Dan straightened up, his jaw set with determination.
Let me talk to her. We have history.
As Dan headed out the door, Thacker's curiosity got the better of him.
History?
Turning to Mike.
Yeah. Thompson introduced Dan to Susan in Rome. Susan is Dan's wife.
Dan ducked under the police tape and approached Casey Thompson, who stood impatiently behind the barricade. The reporter's eyes lit up as Dan drew near.
Let's you and I have a talk.
Pointing to the beach. They crossed the highway, dodging traffic, and made their way to a bench on the beach. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air as they sat. Dan loosened his tie, enjoying the cool breeze on his face. Casey wasted no time.
You said robberies?
Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Dan was aware of how weak his earlier explanation had been.
When you take a life, you take everything that person has or ever will have. That makes it a robbery of sorts.
Thompson let out a derisive snort, followed by a laugh.
You've got to be kidding.
Dan closed his eyes for a moment, the sounds and scents of the ocean washing over him. Then he turned to KC and made his pitch.
I'll tell you everything, on one condition.
Thompson's posture changed. She pulled away warily.
You give us, Mike and me, and the LAPD, a few days.
Dan saw Casey's face recoil. Before the reporter could protest, he quickly added,
And when we get the killer, you'll be in on the arrest. If at all possible, you'll be there at the end.
Casey let out a low whistle. She had to weigh the public's right to know against scooping everyone in Los Angeles on the capture of a crazed killer.
Gotta admit, that's some carrot.
After a brief hesitation, Casey Thompson signaled her agreement. Dan took a deep breath and began.
When you were in Rome, did you hear about the murder of Maria Albano?
Alarm flashed across the reporter's face, and Dan knew he had her full attention. From a distance, an astute observer might have seen two people in business clothes engaged in a lively talk on a beach, their bodies offering a visual commentary as the discussion unfolded. Dan remained seated, his posture steady and composed as he methodically laid out the case, his hands moving occasionally to emphasize key points. Casey's movements, on the other hand, were as different from Dan's as chalk from cheese. They told an entirely different story. She stood up abruptly, only to sink back down moments later, as if Dan's words were too much to bear. Then, unable to contain her restlessness, she paced back and forth, her footsteps digging into the sand. Twice, she brought her hands to her mouth in shock, her eyes wide as she took in each detail. As Dan got to the end, Casey walked a few steps away, her back to the detective. She looked at the ocean for a moment and then turned back to Dan. Stunned, Casey uttered,
For the love of Christ.
Dan looked directly at the reporter, his voice just above a whisper.
Just give us a few days, Casey. That's all I'm asking. A few days to catch this bastard before he kills again, before panic takes over.
Casey Thompson was way ahead of the detective, her reporter's mind racing.
You mean before my paper prints a 3-inch headline that reads, Jack the Ripper in LA?
She raised her palms together in front of Dan's face and pulled them apart to help him visualize the headline.
Is that what you mean?
Nearly yelling. She slapped her hands on her hips to make her disbelief clear.
Yeah, something like that.
A few minutes later, they shook hands, and Casey looked Dan square in the eye.
Good luck.
Casey was concerned for what Dan was going through, and she was excited for being on the edge of a monster story. Dan made his way back to the Beach Inn, where 3 Los Angeles Police Department detectives and 1 Army captain waited.
Well?
Senior Detective Colin Thacker's eyes searched Dan's face for any sign that their collective asses were, or were not, about to be kicked to Pasadena. Dan allowed himself a small smile.
We got 3 days.
Dan stood with the other detectives in the shade of the Beach Inn, feeling some relief from the sun. He watched as the parking lot emptied, the last of the curious onlookers and witnesses finally departing. Across the highway, he could see a family playing with a beach ball near the water's edge, their laughter carried on the ocean breeze. The thin line of black pavement struck Dan as a flimsy divider between their carefree afternoon and the horror scene behind him, as if something as ordinary as a road could truly separate the world of innocent beachgoers from the brutal reality of Nancy Sanchez's murder. Chapter 31. Standing in the shade of the Beach Inn, Senior Detective Colin Thacker's face was etched with lines of worry, while Detective Lloyd Rice's sharp eyes darted between his colleagues, assessing their state of mind. Detective Keith Wilson shifted his weight from his right foot to his left and back again, his usual energy dampened. Only Mike Fioranti remained unaffected, his uniform neat despite the temperature. Dan envied Mike's ability to ignore the heat as he tugged at his tie again in a vain attempt to cool himself. Lloyd Rice cleared his throat, his gaunt face set in a serious expression.
We know Candy's real name, Cindy Finch, high school valedictorian at Santa Cruz High a few years ago.
Then, shaking his head,
Was the lead in the school's production of Our Town. Came to Los Angeles to be an actress.
Dan's chest sank. Another young life cut short, another dream dead. Rice continued with his report.
When I talked to the Santa Cruz PD, the desk sergeant said Cindy had gone to school with his daughter. Never imagined. He was upset. The officer was going to see the family. He was not looking forward to it. We've got 14 detective officer pairs canvassing the city. They're talking to everyone. Prostitutes, shopkeepers, beggars, motel clerks. Hopefully they'll turn something up.
Dan nodded and glanced at Mike. It was remarkable how little the heat seemed to affect him. Detective Rice cleared his throat, drawing Dan's attention back.
Last night, when we got the hit on another note booking room, just like with Susie Duke, we thought we had him. Waited for hours. Something must have spooked him. He regrouped and got Nancy Sanchez to come here. Completely fucked us.
Dan and Mike exchanged a weary look. They could only offer sympathetic nods to their colleagues' frustration. Dan said,
Our killer won't book another room with a note.
All of them knew this to be true. They had one good chance to catch him, and it was gone. Next time, it would be different. How different it would be, none could even hazard a guess. At that moment, a fast-moving yellow cab screeched to a halt across the road. It surprised them all. Dan watched as the driver flung open his door and jumped out. As he ran across the road, he dodged cars, narrowly avoiding being hit. The man's eyes were wild as he approached the detectives.
The girl who was killed, was she Mexican? Nancy?
The cabbie blurted out, his breathing ragged as he searched each detective's face. Detective Rice, who was nearest, gave a simple nod in response. The confirmation shattered something within the cabbie. He doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping.
Oh my God. What? Oh my God.
Dan instinctively moved forward, reaching out to support the man as he struggled to raise his head. The cabbie's eyes, filled with a desperate plea for understanding, looked up into Dan's.
I drove her here.
He choked out, his voice almost a cry. Then, louder, more insistent,
I brought her here last night. Here. A cop told me there had been a killing, and I knew.
Dan shivered despite the heat. He tried to find the right words, knowing that nothing he could say would help. Moments later, Frank Abbott, the cabbie, sat hunched over on the curb a short distance away, a patrolman keeping him company. The man's body shuddered as he recounted his story again, the weight of his guilt evident in every word. Dan understood the cabbie's pain. He knew all too well the burden of regret, of wishing one could go back and change the smallest of decisions that had led to such tragic consequences. Abbott had simply been trying to make a living, unaware of the danger he was delivering Nancy Sanchez into. Frank Abbott muttered and sighed. He said the same thing again and again.
How could I have known? How could I have known?
The cabbie's voice rose and fell, punctuated by long pauses as he fought back tears. Dan found himself replaying the man's frantic arrival in his mind. He recalled the sheer panic in Abbott's eyes when he realized the victim was the same girl he had driven to this very spot last night. Though Abbott's actions had been innocent, his guilt would likely haunt him for years. Dan Kelly listened intently as the younger detectives shared their findings. The sun had moved to the west, and they were now fully exposed. He could feel sweat trickling down his back beneath his shirt. He shielded his eyes from the glare, focusing on Wilson's words.
The killer left no evidence behind at the first three. The 3 LA murders. So far, nothing here.
Dan's mind raced, piecing together what they had.
None of the women worked in a house or had a pimp. And 3 of the 4 women were killed in cheap hotels or motels. Candy Floss was killed in her home. Why? In a motel, there's less chance of the killer's comings and goings being noticed, which is smart.
Rice sighed, his face looking even more drawn in the harsh sunlight.
We've been digging into the victims' backgrounds. Susie Duke was a runaway from San Diego, came to LA looking for a job, spent a few months working in a beauty parlor, and ended up working the streets.
Rice had just given them the history on Candy Floss, also known as Cindy Finch. That left Amy Carson. They were now certain that Amy Carson was an alias, as no one matching her particulars seemed to exist. And finally, there was Nancy Sanchez, dead about 15 hours.
Any luck finding a connection between them?
Rice shook his head.
Nothing helpful. Different parts of town, different clienteles. The only thing linking them, they were prostitutes.
Thacker, who hadn't spoken, stepped forward.
What about the crime scenes? Any patterns there?
Wilson shrugged.
Just what Detective Kelly said. 3 out of 4 were killed in hotels. Cindy Finch was the odd one out, killed in her own home.
The group fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The sound of traffic and the occasional cry of a seagull filled the void. Dan then asked about forensics. Wilson shook his head. Frustration was evident.
Nothing. The killer's careful. No fingerprints, no fibers. It's like he's a ghost.
Mike shuffled his feet, drawing Dan's attention.
What about witnesses? Someone must have seen something.
I talked to one girl, a woman who knew Susie Duke well. She said Susie had a regular who paid generously and was rough. Rough enough to leave bruises,
said Detective Rice.
The woman, Millie, thought the guy was a big shot in business or a lawyer. She had no name.
He went on to say that this information was passed on to the detective officer pairs. But so far, there had been no corroboration, and most importantly, no name. Dan looked over at the cabbie, Frank Abbott, still sitting on the curb nearby, racked with guilt over unwittingly delivering Nancy Sanchez to her death. The sun continued to beat down, relentless and unforgiving. Yet, as Dan absorbed the other's words, his resolve to stay optimistic strengthened. They were dedicated professionals, every single one. They would track down the murderer. There was no other option. Chapter 32. As Mike steered the car through the crowded Los Angeles streets, Dan sat beside him, his mind churning. A disheartened Detective Thacker sat in the back seat. They were on their way to Nancy Sanchez's apartment. Mike broke the silence.
This is new to me. I mean, when we work a case like this one, violent, the offender has almost always been nearby. Sometimes standing over the victim with a weapon in hand.
Thacker leaned back, taking in Mike's words.
Red-handed. Yeah, that's nice,
he said almost wistfully. The detective paused, closing his eyes briefly before continuing.
We're dealing with the murders of prostitutes. The truth, the sad truth, is nobody cares about dead whores. Except for their mothers, nobody cares at all.
He turned to look out the window as Los Angeles passed by and added with sadness,
and sometimes, not even their mothers.
Thacker's cigar bobbed as he spoke, his frustration evident.
Hell, we didn't pay much attention until we had 2 dead girls. Now there are 4. The fact they're working girls has kept the press off my back. Until now. With 4, even those idiots at the Examiner will catch on. Surprised the Times hasn't yet. We have 3 days before your reporter chum from the Standard runs her headline. Jack the Ripper strikes Los Angeles.
He shook his head in dismay, chomping on his unlit cigar.
What do you say in the Army? Situation normal, all fucked up? Well, gentlemen, if we don't get this guy fast, we will have a snafu of biblical proportions.
The car grew quiet again, each man lost in his own thoughts. Dan's voice, when it finally came, was soft and filled with concern.
It's one of ours. We plucked him out of his life. He was a teacher, a dishwasher, or a clerk. And we sent him to war to stop Hitler. And it was not like the movies. Not like anything you could imagine. It broke him. And we didn't even notice.
10 minutes later, the trio arrived at Nancy's apartment. Detective Thacker exchanged a few hushed words with a uniformed officer, standing guard at the door, before nodding to Dan and Mike. They entered, the door closing behind them. In contrast to the hellhole that was Candy Floss's place, now known to be Cindy Finch, Nancy Sanchez's home was clean, bright and tidy. The difference was largely due to Cindy Finch being a heroin addict and the destruction that it inevitably brings. But Dan thought there was more to it. A vase of fresh daisies added color, and the air smelled like the place had just been cleaned with pine sol. The person who lived here, Dan realized, took pride in her home. The three men split up, each taking a different section of the modest space. Mike headed into the bathroom, his eyes scanning every surface meticulously. Dan made his way to the bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Thacker, cigar still clamped between his teeth, stayed in the kitchen and living room. In the bathroom, Mike found several prescription bottles tucked away in the medicine cabinet. He called for evidence bags and carefully sealed them inside. He looked behind and inside the toilet tank, having learned this trick from the late Cindy Finch. There was nothing. Dan methodically combed through the bedroom, opening drawers and peering under the bed. The closet yielded a number of sexy outfits, but nothing of interest. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Colin Thacker immediately found Nancy's money jar in a cupboard. A small smile of satisfaction wrapped around his cigar stub. He knew he had handled this case poorly in the beginning. It was not his best moment. This jar appeared to hold a lot of cash. One thing he could do was ensure this money got to her family, if one could be found. As Thacker looked at the garbage can, something caught his eye. Nestled among the discarded food wrappers and empty containers was a tan envelope, unmarked and inconspicuous. Working carefully, Thacker used a bread knife to lift the envelope from the trash. He placed it gently on the table, his eyes bright with the promise of a potential lead. As Dan and Mike finished their searches, they converged in the kitchen, drawn by Thacker's expression. The detective stood by the table, a slight smile on his face as he pointed at the rescued envelope. The three men exchanged knowing looks. The significance of this discovery was not lost on any of them. Hopefully, this envelope would, after examination, steer their investigation in the right direction. Chapter 33. William Young walked with purpose down the dimly lit street, his body upright and his jaw set with determination. He was filled to the brim with his faith. It was like an all-encompassing hug, a satisfying pressure that reminded him of his mission. His eyes scanned the shadowy corners and alleyways, searching for the lost souls he was determined to save. The memory of his previous failures tried to work their way into his thoughts, but William pushed them aside. Hours spent on his knees praying had filled him with divine power, making his pulse quicken with holy purpose. This time would be different. He was sure of it. His new plan, crafted over many nights of contemplation and prayer, filled him with unwavering conviction. William's hand unconsciously reached for his Bible in the satchel hanging off his shoulder, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. The bag also carried a small jar. With it, he would make his mark. He approached a lonely warehouse. The words Southland Imports stretched across the brick wall in massive blue and yellow lettering. The sun and years of neglect had left the letters faded and cracked. On either end of the sign were large cameo portraits of aviators Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart from their heyday 2 decades before. 3 women dressed to attract interest stood in front of padlocked double doors. William took a deep breath. He could feel Jesus guiding his steps, and he knew that tonight his mission would bear fruit. With unwavering resolve, he prepared to share his message of salvation with these wayward souls. William approached the 3 women, his heart pounding with a sense of purpose. Though outwardly composed, his hands shook as he reached into his bag and clasped the worn Bible, drawing strength from its presence.
Sisters,
his voice ringing with conviction.
Have you not read the words of the Lord? Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body.
Take a look at this fool.
The women, however, seemed entirely disinterested in William's earnest efforts to save their souls.
Maybe we should take a break and get something to eat.
Yeah, not much going on.
They went on with their idle chatter.
I was talking to Katie. She said it's better on torrents.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Occasionally shooting him dismissive looks before turning away, for good.
I could use a coffee.
Undeterred, William pressed on, his fervor growing.
Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God?
His plea only drew laughter.
Crazy.
He pulled out the small jar from his shoulder bag, unscrewing the lid with trembling fingers. As the women continued to ignore him, their laughter grating against his ears, William's body surged with righteous indignation. From Isaiah, the words leapt from his mouth.
Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow.
Bible Bill flung the contents of the jar, painting a swath of blood red across the belly of the nearest woman's yellow dress. The woman shrieked as she looked down at the garish red stain.
What the fuck?
The other women joined in the chorus of screams, their faces contorted in shock and outrage. Without hesitation, they charged toward William, who turned and fled, his feet pounding against the street.
Oh my God! Get that bastard!
Get him!
The defaced woman kicked off her heels, her stocking feet slapping the pavement as she ran in hot pursuit. The scarlet stain on her yellow dress seemed to spread with every frantic step, a grotesque result of the assault she had just endured.
You bastard! I'm gonna get you!
Her shouts echoed through the night, bouncing off buildings and grabbing everyone's attention as they burst onto a busy street. The woman's cries grew more intense as she gained on her fleeing assailant.
Get that fucker!
Vehicles lurched to a stop, rubber shrieking against asphalt and car horns wailing as motorists slammed their brakes, desperate to dodge both the chaos erupting in front of them and one another. One car, in a panicky attempt to avoid the angry woman, ran up on the sidewalk, narrowly missing a couple, window shopping with their backs to the street. Pedestrians, shopkeepers, and drivers froze in shock at the sight of the screaming, red-stained woman chasing her wild-eyed attacker.
My dress! I'm gonna cut your balls off, you stupid dumb fucker!
The torrent of obscenity spewing from the wronged woman caused more than one member of her sex to cover her ears. A small terrier joined the commotion, yanking against its tether until it wrenched free from its master's grasp. The yapping canine bolted in pursuit of the woman, who in turn chased after the man. A policeman on foot, startled by the uproar, fumbled for his whistle and blew it with all his might. The shrill sound cut through the commotion like a knife, drawing even more attention to the unfolding spectacle. Several confused men moved to corral the terrified William. They struggled to make sense of the bizarre scene, their eyes darting between the terrified man and the enraged woman behind him. As they closed in, William's eyes grew wide with panic. His Bible clutched tightly to his chest like a shield against the chaos he had unleashed. Chapter 34. The telephone woke Kate Becker. Her eyes snapped open, her heart racing as she fought to clear her head. The ringing phone seemed to the half-awake Kate as loud as a fire alarm. Stumbling out of bed in her pajamas, Kate lurched toward the kitchen. Her toe caught the edge of a chair, sending a shot of pain through her foot. She bit back a scream and swallowed the curse that threatened to escape her lips. Fumbling in the dark, her hands found the phone on the wall. She yanked the receiver off its cradle, pressing it to her ear.
Hello? Yes. Yes. We'll be there in 10 minutes.
Kate hung up the phone. She turned on the light in her daughter's bedroom. Allison lay on her side, head tilted back, mouth agape in deep sleep. She shook her awake.
Wake up, sweetheart. Cappy called.
Kate's eyes found the kitchen clock. Still in a stupor, reading the time was a challenge. Her brain tried to put it together. The little hand was on the 1 and the big hand was on the 8. It was 1:40 in the morning. 4 minutes later, Kate and Allie stood on the landing outside their apartment. Kate had pulled on pants, slipped into loafers, tucked in her pajama top, and thrown on a jacket. Allie was dressed much the same way, except with sneakers instead of loafers. Her part required better shoes. The night air was crisp as they made their way down the wooden stairs, each foot carefully placed to avoid tripping. Flashlight in hand, Kate located her car parked at the curb. They jumped in. The old sedan's doors groaned in protest as they were pulled shut. The engine came to life, and they found themselves moving in eerie silence down Main Street. Pulling up to the Red Rock, Kate got out of her car with the motor still humming, Allie trailing in her wake. When she pulled the tavern's entrance wide, a wall of clamor and cigarette haze burst forth. She hadn't expected to find Cappy shoving an inebriated Marty McDougal toward the exit. The drunk man's voice shattered the midnight quiet of their sleepy downtown as he bellowed a tone-deaf version of "Roll Me Over in the Clover."
My bag of tricks. Roll me over, lay me down and do it again. Roll me over in the clover. Roll me over, lay me down and do it.
Cappy, looking both amused and relieved, handed off Marty to Kate and her daughter.
Hey, Beckers. He's all yours.
Thanks, Cappy. We've got it from here.
Good luck.
Wishing them good luck before retreating into the bar's smoky interior. Kate's initial attempts to quiet Marty were hard misses, his jovial singing continuing unabated. It wasn't until his bleary eyes focused on Allie that he became somewhat aware of his surroundings. Realizing the inappropriateness of his chosen song for such young company, Marty shushed himself mid-lyric, dissolving into a fit of giggles that shook his entire frame. Allie pushed Marty down the sidewalk, her hands gripping the handles of his wheelchair firmly as she navigated the uneven pavement. Kate drove alongside them in her car, matching their slow but steady pace. The car's headlights carved long, shifting shadows down the quiet street. Allie found herself grateful for the extra light, as it made steering Marty's chair over the cracked concrete in the night easier. Marty, still giddy from his evening's adventures, was having an absolute blast. He chuckled and waved at imagined spectators.
Well, hello. Nice to see you all.
Thoroughly enjoying being at the center of this curious nocturnal parade. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Allie couldn't help but smile despite the late hour, the task she and her mother had signed up for. The cool air nipped at her cheeks, and she could hear the distant hoot of an owl, reminding her of just how late it was. As they made their way through the oblivious town, they traded paved sidewalks for gravel streets. The pushing grew harder, and Allie's arms began to tire. The smaller front wheels of Marty's chair would frequently jam on stones, eliciting a grunt, groan, or an occasional curse from Allie. She pressed on, determined to see Marty safely home. 12 minutes later, though to Allie's aching muscles, it felt like an hour. They arrived at Marty's house. The familiar bungalow came into view, its porch light a welcoming beacon completely lost on Marty, now fast asleep. Soon, the two women found themselves inside Marty's house, having positioned him and his chair beside his bed. Wheels locked, Kate put herself in front of Marty. She unbuttoned and removed his shirt. Then, crouching down to his eye level, she wrapped her arms around him in a firm hug, throwing his arms around her neck. Together, in whispers, mother and daughter said,
On 3. 1, 2, 3.
Kate straightened her legs, lifting Marty out of his chair. Allie unlocked the wheelchair's brakes and eased it back, clearing space beside the bed. Kate pivoted carefully and helped Marty sit on the edge of the mattress. Working together, they guided him down until he was resting flat, his breathing steady and calm. Allie slipped off his shoes and set them neatly aside. The whole process took less than a minute. Marty, who had been too weak to assist, now lay with his head on the pillow, his earlier singing replaced by the quiet rhythm of sleep. Kate, her face taut with focus, adjusted his clothing and drew a blanket over him to keep him warm. Allie straightened the bedclothes at the foot of the bed as her mother finished tucking him in. With a small nod, they made sure he was comfortable and secure. Now Marty lay still in the center of the bed, dressed in his undershirt, the lines of fatigue softened by rest. Kate smoothed the blanket one last time and brushed a hand over his shoulder. The tenderness in her movements stirred something deep in Allie's chest. She bent over, pressing a soft kiss to Uncle Marty's forehead, her lips just grazing his skin. As she straightened, she caught her mother's eye, sharing a moment of unspoken love for the man before them.